His tank was dead. No parts. No hope. But mechanic Alexander Petrov saw something in the wreckage that no one else dared to touch. January 1942. Eastern Front. -30 degrees. The cold didn't just bite. It killed. Soviet T-34 tanks froze solid at night. Engines wouldn't turn. Crews couldn't move. And every broken tank meant one less gun pointed at the Germans. Petrov knew this. He felt it in his frozen fingers. He heard it in the silence of his disabled machine. The tank that his crew depended on lay useless in the snow. The main engine mount was shattered. The replacement part didn't exist. Supply trucks never came. The nearest factory was thousands of kilometers away. His commanding officer gave him one choice: fix it or watch your crew die in the next battle. Petrov walked past the burned-out German Panzer. Its hull was torn open by Soviet guns. Parts lay scattered. He stopped. He stared at the German machine. Then he looked back at his own broken T-34. For 30 seconds he didn't move. He was thinking the thought that could kill him. A thought no Soviet soldier was supposed to think. What if he didn't care which flag was stamped on those parts? What if survival was the only flag that mattered? That moment, standing in the frozen silence, was when everything changed. When duty and treason became the same choice. Alexander Petrov wasn't a hero. He was a mechanic. A man who understood machines better than he understood people. He came from the Urals, where factories ran day and night, and metal was treated like sacred blood. His father worked in a steel mill. His mother died when he was 12. He learned early that hands were more honest than words. By 18 he could disassemble an engine blindfolded. By 23 the Red Army drafted him. By 24 he was on the frozen Eastern Front, keeping the T-34 alive. Keeping his men alive. Petrov had a crew of 5. A driver named Volkov who'd been with him since Moscow. A gunner called Dmitry, barely 20, who talked too much about his sister back home. A loader named Grishin who never complained. A commander, Senior Sergeant Lebedev, who trusted Petrov more than he trusted the generals. They weren't friends exactly. War doesn't make friends. It makes brothers who don't have a choice. They were bound by metal and ice and the knowledge that a single frozen bolt could mean the difference between living and burning. Petrov loved this machine like he'd never loved anything else. Not because it was Soviet. Not because of Stalin or the party. Because it was real. It was honest. It did what he told it to do. It never lied. And now it was dead in his hands. Lebedev came to him on the morning of the second day. The senior sergeant's face was the color of ash. He didn't say hello. He just said, "The tank must run. That's all. I don't want to know how." It was the most dangerous order Petrov ever received. Because it wasn't really an order. It was permission to break the law. In the Soviet army there were rules. Strict ones. Use only approved Soviet parts. Never tamper with enemy equipment. Never enter captured zones without authorization. Breaking these rules was sabotage. Helping the enemy. Treason. The punishment was always the same. A bullet in the back of the head. Fast. No trial. No mercy. But Lebedev was saying something else entirely. He was saying, "I need your tank running more than I need you to follow the rules. And I will never ask you what you did." That was loyalty. That was Soviet command. And that was the hook that caught Petrov. Petrov walked to the German wreckage. The Panzer had been destroyed 3 days earlier. Its armor was torn. Its crew burned inside. The engine, though, was a miracle. Intact. Complete. Everything he needed. He knelt in the snow and stared at the German engine. For the first time he understood something terrible. The Germans built good machines. Honest machines. It made no difference to the metal whether it served Berlin or Moscow. He just wanted to work. He reached out and touched the cold German steel. His hands shook. Not from cold. From knowing that touching this metal meant crossing a line he could never uncross. That night, Petrov didn't sleep. He sat by the fire watching the flames. Around him his crew slept. Volkov snored. Dmitry whispered names in his dreams. His sister, his mother, a girl he loved. Grishin just lay still like a dead man waiting to become real. Petrov's mind was screaming. One voice said, "You are Soviet. You are loyal. You do not touch German machines." You do not betray your country. Another voice was quieter but louder. Your crew will die if that tank doesn't run. Lebedev knows it. You know it. The Germans know it. The next battle is coming. 3 days, maybe 4. And when it comes, your tank needs to move or your men burn. The fire crackled. A piece of wood collapsed into ash. He stood up. He walked into the darkness. Behind him, the T-34 sat like a sleeping animal, broken and useless. Ahead of him, through the snow, he could see the German wreckage. The Panzer was like a corpse, already consumed by decay and fire. Petrov knew the story the officers would tell if they found him. He was stealing German parts. He was collaborating with the enemy. He was a traitor. But Lebedev's eyes had already told him a different story. A story the officers would never write down. A story that lived in silence and loyalty and the unspoken rule of survival. He walked toward the German tank. He worked in darkness. No lights. Too dangerous. A single flashlight could draw attention. So Petrov worked by touch, learning the German engine like a blind man reads Braille. His fingers became his eyes. The Panzer's engine was cleaner than the Soviet equivalent. Tighter tolerances. German engineering was precise. Cold. Without mercy. Like a German soldier, Petrov thought. Built to function. Built to dominate. Built to win. But that night, under his hands, the German engine was just metal. Just physics. Just neat. The main bearing was damaged. But the secondary mounts were perfect. He unbolted them one by one in the freezing dark. His fingers were numb. He couldn't feel the cold anymore. That was the worst part. When your body stops telling you that you're suffering, you know you're close to the end. By 3 a.m. he had what he needed. 12 replacement parts. Small. Crucial. German. Everything his T-34 was missing. He loaded them onto a sledge. Covered them with canvas and snow. And then he walked back to his own machine, dragging German parts across Soviet ice. Each step was a betrayal. Each step was survival. Both at the same time. He didn't know which one was which anymore. By dawn he had the engine mount reassembled. Soviet frame. German mounts. A hybrid machine. Neither Soviet nor German. Something new. Something that shouldn't exist. He poured the last of the fuel into the tank. The engine had to start. If it didn't, if he'd wasted the night, if the German parts didn't fit or work, then he was a thief. A saboteur. A man who'd stolen enemy equipment for nothing. Lebedev stood 20 meters away with his arms folded. Watching. Not helping. Not witnessing. Just watching. Petrov climbed into the tank. The darkness inside was absolute. The smell was oil and ice and fear. He pressed the starter. The engine groaned. Once. Twice. 3 times. Nothing. His heart stopped. This was it. This was the moment it all fell apart. In 3 hours the officers would arrive for morning inspection. In 3 hours they would find German parts. In 3 hours he would be shot. He pressed the starter again. The engine caught. Turned over. Rumbled to life. The whole machine shook. For 60 seconds the engine ran rough, fighting the cold, fighting the wrong fuel, fighting 67 years of difference between Berlin and Moscow. And then it smoothed. It found its rhythm. It ran. Petrov wanted to scream. He wanted to cry. He wanted to confess everything. Instead, he sat in the darkness and let the engine sing. Outside he heard Lebedev laugh. Just once. A short, sharp sound that meant, "You did it? Now we are both complicit." For 37 hours the tank ran perfectly. The hybrid engine, German parts fused into Soviet steel, worked better than it ever had. The crew felt it. Volkov drove it with a smile. Dmitri cleaned his gun and hummed a song about Moscow. Grishin loaded shells with the confidence of a man who knew his machine was faithful. Only Petrov knew the truth. Only Petrov lived in the space between genius and execution. The space where survival becomes a crime. He checked the engine every 4 hours. He cleaned the carburetor. He bled air from the fuel lines. He did everything a mechanic should do. But inside he was watching over his shoulder. Waiting for the officers. Waiting for inspection. Waiting for someone to open the engine block and see the German markings on the mounts. Lebedev never asked how he did it. That was the agreement. That was survival. The orders came on the second evening. Move north. A German column was advancing. The 76th Tank Regiment was being withdrawn to a new position. They had 2 hours to prepare. 2 hours. That was all Petrov had left. In 2 hours either the T-34 would move under its own power, or it would stay frozen in the snow, and his crew would march into battle on foot against panzers and machine guns. The tank started on the first try. Lebedev nodded. Volkov grinned. Dmitri climbed in behind the gun. They drove north, and Petrov never looked back at the burned-out German machine he'd desecrated. He never looked back at the line he'd crossed. He just looked forward. To the next battle. To the next impossible choice. To the next moment when loyalty and treason became the same thing. The inspection came 43 hours after they left the encampment. The new position was 20 kilometers north. A frozen village. Empty. The regiment was spread thin, preparing defensive positions. A major arrived by staff car. Not a regular major. An NKVD major. The secret police. State security. Men who didn't care about winning the war. They cared about finding traitors. He went straight to Lebedev. No courtesy. No introduction. Just, your tank performed at 73% efficiency above baseline. We want to know why. Lebedev said nothing. There are German components. We can see the markings. On the engine mounts. Where did they come from? Lebedev still said nothing. The major's face went cold. Are you refusing to answer? Or do you need a few hours in the interrogation tent to remember? That was when Petrov stepped forward. He didn't know why. He just opened his mouth and spoke. Sir. I did it. The original mounts were cracked. I used German parts from a destroyed Panzer to maintain combat readiness. I take full responsibility. The major stared at him for 30 seconds. The silence was lethal. Around them the crew had stopped moving. They watched. They knew what came next. They knew they would hear a gunshot or an order. Execution or court-martial. The major turned to Lebedev. Did you authorize this? Lebedev said, No, sir. I did not know about the parts. The mechanic acted on his own initiative to keep the regiment combat effective. The major looked at both men. He was thinking. Calculating. Political survival equations that had nothing to do with the Eastern Front. Then he said something no one expected. The engine mounts pass inspection. The tank runs. That's what matters. From this moment forward, this tank has only Soviet components. Do you understand? He was giving them permission. He was also taking responsibility. If anyone asked questions later, he would say, I inspected it. It was Soviet. I signed the forms. In that moment, Petrov understood something deeper about the Soviet system. Treason wasn't betrayal. Treason was weakness. And the only unforgivable crime was letting someone find out that you were weak. Survival, he realized, wasn't an individual thing. It was a network. A web of silence. A shared agreement that some stories would never be told. After the major left, no one spoke about what had happened. That was the Soviet way. The truth was erased before it was even born. The forms were signed. The documents sealed. The story locked behind a vault of silence. But Petrov understood what had happened. The major had become his partner in the crime. The moment the major said, this tank has only Soviet components, he made himself equally guilty. He made himself equally complicit. Now, if Petrov ever talked, if he ever told what really happened, the major would hang alongside him. The major had bought his silence with his own corruption. It was perfectly Soviet. Perfectly ruthless. Perfectly sane. Petrov never spoke about it. Not to Volkov. Not to Dmitri. Not to Lebedev. Not to anyone. In 3 weeks, he would receive news that Lebedev had been transferred to another regiment. In 4 weeks, the major would be reassigned to Moscow. The witnesses would disperse. The story would vanish. But Petrov carried it with him. Every day. Every hour. The weight of the thing he'd done. The weight of the thing he'd survived. The tank kept running. It ran through the rest of January. Through February. Through the spring thaw when the ice became mud and the mud became everything. It ran until June when the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa's final offensive and everything changed forever. By then, Petrov had stopped asking if he was a hero or a criminal. He'd stopped asking if what he'd done was right or wrong. Those categories didn't exist anymore. They were luxuries for people who didn't have to choose between their own death and their crew's survival. There were only two kinds of men on the Eastern Front: men who made impossible choices and men who died. Petrov was still alive. In May 1942, the German army attacked again. Operation Blue. The largest offensive of the war. Millions of men. Thousands of tanks. The Soviets were falling back. The T-34 regiment was being pushed west and north, chasing a line that moved every day. The tank never stopped running. Petrov had given it life. Now it refused to die. He understood something in those months. The machine didn't care where it came from. It didn't care that German hands had built the mounts that now held its heart. It didn't care about betrayal or loyalty or treason. It only cared about motion. About doing what it was built to do. Sometimes at night, Petrov would listen to the engine. The way it ran. The rhythm of the German precision fused with Soviet need. He would hear it like a voice. Not quite German. Not quite Soviet. Something new. Something that shouldn't exist but did. He never told anyone this. But he understood that he'd created something immortal. Not the tank. The choice. The moment when he decided that his crew's survival was bigger than the law. That choice lived in the machine now. Every kilometer it moved, every shell it fired, every battle it survived, it was all built on the foundation of a single night in January when a mechanic took German parts into his hands and decided that honor was a luxury the dead could afford. The rest of them were still alive. And that was the only currency that mattered. Lebedev was promoted to captain. The crew got new uniforms. The war ground on. By August, the regiment would be fighting near Stalingrad. By September, Volkov would be dead. Shot through the head by a German sniper. Dmitri would survive. Grishin would lose his right arm. The tank would be destroyed in street fighting, burned by German soldiers with flamethrowers. But in May, none of that had happened yet. The tank was alive. The crew was alive. Petrov was alive. And the German parts were still beating at the heart of the machine, keeping them all breathing. By the time the T-34 was destroyed in September, the war had changed everything. Stalingrad was a graveyard. The Germans had been pushed back. The Soviets were beginning to push forward. The great machine had turned. But Petrov never saw it. He was wounded in July. A shell fragment caught him in the left shoulder. The wound wasn't fatal. But it got infected. Gangrene. The infection spread. By August, the doctors told him, "We can save your arm or we can save your life." Not both. He chose his life. The arm came off 3 centimeters below the shoulder. When he woke from the anesthetic, a Soviet military doctor was standing over him. "You're finished. War's over for you. You're going back to Moscow." Petrov spent the rest of the war in a factory training new mechanics. His right arm was gone. But his mind was still there. His hands, what was left of them, could still teach, could still build, could still repair. He never talked about what he'd done. The German parts. The night in the darkness. The Major's complicity. That story was locked inside him and it stayed there. The war ended in May 1945. Petrov was 41 years old. He'd lost an arm. He'd seen 10,000 men die. He kept a machine alive through the most brutal conditions the Eastern Front could create. After the war, they gave him a medal. For service in defense of the Soviet Union. Nothing about the T-34. Nothing about the German parts. Nothing about the choice that had kept his crew alive. He lived another 32 years. Worked as a mechanic until he was 70. Never married. Never talked about the war. Never told anyone about the night he crossed the line between treason and survival. He died in 1977, unremarked, unknown, carrying with him the secret that had kept him and his crew alive for 4 months in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. Alexander Petrov was forgotten. Not just by history. By everyone. His name was never written down. The T-34 he kept alive was destroyed by German soldiers in street fighting in Stalingrad. The crew was split up. Volkov died. Dmitri survived the war and died in 1962. Lebedev became a colonel and died in 1978. The NKVD major was executed in the purges of 1948. The secret that kept them alive died with them. But here's what we know now. We know that thousands of Soviet mechanics made the same choice. We know that the rules of war are written by people who don't have to die. We know that survival, true survival, always requires breaking something. The law, the code, the conscience. Petrov's T-34 didn't win the war, but it kept 5 men alive for 4 months on the frozen Eastern Front. 4 months of battles. 4 months of impossible odds. 4 months of men who should have died but didn't. Was he a traitor? Yes. By the law he was. He used enemy parts to repair Soviet equipment without authorization. That's the definition. Was he a hero? No. He didn't do it for glory. He did it because his crew was going to die if he didn't. He did it because the machine was broken and the parts didn't exist anywhere else. He did it because sometimes, when you're standing at the edge of the abyss, survival and morality become two different languages. What was he then? He was a man who loved his machine and his crew more than he loved the law. He was a man who understood that orders written in Moscow meant nothing in the frozen snow of January. He was a man who accepted the possibility of execution so that his brothers could keep breathing. Is that treason? Is that heroism? Is it both? Is it neither? I don't know. Maybe only Petrov knew. And his secret died with him in 1977. But here's what we do know. The T-34 ran. The crew survived. And in the machinery of that survival, German steel beat at the heart of a Soviet machine. It was an impossible choice. It was the only choice. It was the story of 10 million men on the Eastern Front, each one of them breaking the rules just enough to stay alive another day. The war destroyed 11 million Soviet soldiers. And millions more were saved by mechanics like Petrov. Men who looked at impossible odds, German wreckage, and the frozen night, and decided that their crew mattered more than the law. At the end, you have to ask yourself, what would you have done? Would you have let the machine freeze? Would you have let your brothers die? Or would you have walked into the darkness and taken the German parts? The answer lives in all of us. In every moment when we have to choose between what's right and what's necessary, between following the rules and saving the people we love. Petrov made that choice. He lived. He lost an arm. He carried the secret to his grave. And his T-34 kept running through the blood and ice of the Eastern Front. That was enough.